Okay, good morning, everyone. I am trying something new today, and that is broadcasting this to LinkedIn. It might work, it might not, it might be a cool thing, it might be a disaster. I don't know, but we'll figure it out. We're doing many first things today. Anyway, let me tell you about the format, because this is also a new format. And basically, we're here in Toronto. We are joined today by these amazing speakers, all have one in common. They're not in Toronto and their projects are not in Toronto. And that was the premise of this webinar. So thank you again for joining us. The topic of today is designing waterfronts, and specifically waterfront landscapes. And I invited 3 case studies. Specifically, the case studies will be in Vietnam, Brazil, and Germany. Each speaker is going to present it. The format is as follows. Each of them is going to present for 10 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. But again, the format is compact and sweet and short and to the point. Let's get started. Michael, please, let's just get started.
All right, let's get going. I'm going to share my screen here and bring everyone to Vietnam for the morning. So let me know if you all can see this clearly.
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. So, thank you so much for joining us on this journey around the world today. I'm really excited to share the urban design strategy for the Saigon Riverfront in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, that my team at Sasaki has been leading. Now, as designers, we often dwell here on the polished image of the future. Design is an act of optimism, so it's only natural that we have a tendency to celebrate the vision of the future instead of focusing on the complex and often messy planning and design process, or on the past and ongoing realities of the site and its context. But I think it's important to begin here. Although the majority of humanity now lives in cities, they can still be very inhumane places. The paradigm shift that happened in many North American and European cities as a reaction against the disorder and inequity of the industrial age still exists. It's just a little less overt to us. But in developing nations in Asia and Africa, people are still dying as a result of poor sanitation and disease as we continue to encroach on our natural environment and build without an equitable approach to design. I'm personally very much inspired by Richard Weller at the University of Pennsylvania, who developed a series of maps called the Atlas for the End of the World, which documents some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. Many of these ecosystems are in direct conflict with rapidly expanding cities in Asia and Africa, and how we design cities in these regions to protect sensitive habitats, reduce sprawl into natural areas, and provide access to nature so that people still feel connected to the landscape within an urban environment is essential. With that in mind, for the Saigon Riverfront, we considered a holistic approach to equity, the environment, and resiliency in our work. As with most cities, Ho Chi Minh's waterfront has been shaped by industrial uses as it evolved from a small fishing settlement to a colonial port into a maritime juggernaut that powered the rapid 21st century urbanization of Vietnam. Today, the site consists of a former port defined by its industrial landscapes of hard edges, historic customs houses, warehouses, and port infrastructure. But for over 150 years, port activities prevented the adjacent neighborhood from accessing the river for generations, which led to an inwardly focused community that lacked visual and physical connections to the water. This created an urban slum that many in the government would have liked to have seen torn down. But these neighborhoods are critical to the life of the city. Our goal became simply to upgrade these settlements humanely rather than eliminate them in the name of progress. Although the neighborhood adjacent to the port is a thriving district called District 4 of over 183,000 residents, it's historically been a marginalized community with significantly less public open space and services than other more wealthy districts in Ho Chi Minh City. We quickly realized that a successful urban design solution for the waterfront needed to look beyond that that thin sliver on the historic port site, but to think more holistically of the entire district. Our primary goal became the inherent need to increase the amount, the accessibility, and the connectivity of public open space throughout the district. Now, with minimal disruption to the existing fabric, we drastically increased the amount of public open space from about square meter per person to over 4 square meters per person. And we did this with a very tactical, kind of surgical approach that emphasized connectivity. And since the waterfront was privatized for nearly 2 centuries, reconnecting the river was obviously critical. Throughout the planning and design process, we engaged the public in a dialogue illustrating how these urban improvements might impact their daily lives. Through interviews with local residents, we developed a series of avatars that are simplifications of the people that we spoke with. We then guided each of them through an example of what their daily life might look like and how they might use the various spaces that we were creating. After we unlocked a public open space framework that would create new opportunities for the larger district, we then focused on what we were actually contracted to do, which was to design the riverfront district. We began with 8 core principles that guided our approach. The first principle was to remove the barriers, both physical, visual, and perceptual, between the existing neighborhood and the river. Many of the people we spoke with were concerned about losing their cultural identity and wanted to protect the dynamism and vitality of the neighborhood. So we worked with them to imagine what upgraded streets reaching into the waterfront might look like. Interior streets that offer shaded outdoor cafes, market plazas that create space to trade, to gather, and to celebrate, pocket parks that offer intimate escapes, and pedestrian corridors that recall the district's narrow alleyways. Our second principle was to harness the site's legacy, adaptively reusing the existing port buildings with a variety of new uses that would bring innovation and activity to the waterfront while still recalling its former use. Industrial remnants like overhead gantries and cranes remain in place as artifacts in the public realm. And our third principle was to enhance multimodal connectivity by linking to existing and planned public transit, including a new metro line and a bus rapid transit corridor. The strategy is to transform the existing condition of congestion and chaos into a pedestrian-centric experience that allows for infrastructure and transit to circulate below. Our fourth principle of creating an active and engaging riverfront centered on the lack of a truly accessible and vibrant waterfront condition in Ho Chi Minh City. So the focus was the creation of a series of diversely scaled public spaces that are programmatically linked with adjacent land uses. This formed what we call a kit of parks that considered how each of these spaces might be used from daily life to big events. In each of these spaces, we prioritized access to nature, using the landscape as an opportunity to teach about climate change, biodiversity, native plants and wildlife, and other aspects of the landscape. The fifth principle was to foster vibrant and accessible neighborhoods. And with that, each section of the riverfront has a primary anchor. Density was determined based on proximity to public transit and also steps back from the river to maximize views. Again, we used the avatars to tell the story of how people from around the city might use each of these riverfront neighborhoods. And we deliberately created connections through each neighborhood that reach back into the core of District 4, such that the amenities of the public realm can be shared by all. It was also important to ensure that the riverfront felt unique to its environmental, historical, and cultural context. So the sixth principle considered how to integrate Vietnamese culture into key areas, which are primarily defined by 11 new civic plazas of various scales. We designed each of these plazas as a richly textured experience that maximizes exposure to differences, to diversity, and to the unexpected, intentionally mixing local retail with global brands and creating spaces for festivals, parades, fashion shows, food stalls, and other events. My favorite plaza is across the river from Ho Chi Minh City's new soccer stadium, where we created a space that thrives on the energy and the stadium's noise and lights, and where the game can be broadcast on a floating screen that allows for everyone to view the game in a public celebratory setting, even if you can't afford a ticket. So I don't know about you, but I would much rather be here than squeezing into one of the tiny crammed seats of the stadium any day. Our eighth principle was centered on creating a resilient and sustainable district. To further complicate things, Ho Chi Minh City is ranked among the 10 top global cities most vulnerable to climate change. This image was taken immediately adjacent to our site, and despite the smile on the face of the person driving that moped, I don't think this is an enjoyable or an acceptable way to go about your daily commute. So we needed to design a series of edge treatments that responded to a variety of existing and proposed conditions to protect not just new development, but the population of that entire district beyond. The riverfront landscape is designed as a gradually ascending riparian zone that can accommodate rising floodwaters both seasonally and over time. And nearly a quarter of the entire development area of the port is designed as a water receiving landscape. This landscape also needed to work in tandem with architecture and seek ways to future-proof itself. So imagine in the not so distant future when we hopefully have fewer cars and need to have lower parking requirements due to advances in shared mobility, underground garages can be repurposed as cisterns for storing floodwaters. And the district streetscapes also work to divert rainwater into cisterns and bioswales rather than city storm sewers. And to address the impact of urban heat, over a quarter of the site area has been programmed as a dense tree canopy to create abundant shade. Tall trees were strategically positioned to divert upper level winds down to the ground, trapping them under the canopy and forcing denser humid air higher to maximize thermal comfort. And our eighth and final principle was to leave a memorable impression, partially through the creation of a distinct skyline that was informed, again, by a proximity to transit while also being respectful of historic buildings with height stepping down towards them. This strategy created a natural progression between old and new and a varying rhythm to the city skyline. Overall, our objective was to establish an urban design strategy that considered not simply the next 25 years of development, but also could help to repair some of the missed opportunities from previous planning decisions. So thank you again for your interest and attention. Now I'm going to pass the baton to Ariadne, who's going to talk about her work in Brazil.
Hello. Wow, Michael, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much
Ariadne.
for it. And thank you, our Canadian friends, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you guys today. So let's go. I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the work that we did in the city of Porto Alegre, which is in the south of Brazil. I am a partner at Jaime Lerner Arquitetos Associados, and just as a reminder, Jaime passed away in 2021. He was mayor of Curitiba for 3 times, and he introduced many of the features that characterize Curitiba nowadays. BRT system, transit-oriented development, the idea of urban acupunctures were all things that rose in his mind during these years that he practiced and led our city and our state. And I'm very fortunate to have been born in Curitiba during the times that all these changes were happening. So I leave an open invitation for you guys to come over and see for yourselves. So in 2003, he left the government and began our practice. And we have been working for 20 years now. And this is our head office, only office. And this house was designed by him in the early 60s and already has features such as green roofs and many things that came along later on. And this is us. So you can recognize us when you come to visit, and a little bit of what we do. Michael presented the working principles of the project in Saigon. And we also have our mantra, our 10 commandments, so to speak. And they begin with this little character, which is Vita. Vita is a turtle. And it's a character in a book that Jaime wrote to explain the city for children. And the idea is that the city should be an integrated structure of life, work, mobility, everything together. It's easy to understand that if you are a turtle and you have your shell, which from above kind of resembles the urban fabric, and you break down the shell of the turtle, living here, working there, having leisure elsewhere, you're going to destroy the life of the turtle. And in a metaphor, this is what we did sometimes with our cities, segregating urban functions. So look at the city as this integrated organism and trying to plan accordingly. Have a dream that can be built and shared, a vision to aspire, and build a good narrative to engage people in this process is also very important. And always, cities are for people, cities are the space for us to be together, the space for diversity to meet. So all of these were principles that we tried to apply to the process of designing the Guaíba Waterfront Park. This is an area of almost 7 kilometers long, and we did an overall plan and then detailed plan for different sections. This is a project that is being implemented by the city of Porto Alegre. So in order to make it more feasible, it was designed to also allow for implementation in steps, not the whole thing at once. It's fantastic to see the pictures that Michael showed because it guards so many similarities to the areas that we were working here as well. The park is very close to the core area of Porto Alegre. This was an area that's subject to flooding. In the early 40s, it had this major flood episode that led the city kind of traumatized. And as a consequence, they built a series of flood containment measures, separating the downtown area from the waterfront. And the area of the park itself is a dike. I'm going to show it better in a moment. And it's a shame because across from it, you have this beautiful, beautiful landscape that is the pride of joy and joy of people from Porto Alegre, and amazingly preserved considering how big Porto Alegre is. It's one of the main Brazilian metropolis. So to recuperate this contact with the landscape and nature was also fundamental in the design process. People use it regardless. I was mentioning that this area is connected to a dike. So there was a road that was built, and between the road and the lake of Guaíba, there is a kind of a 7-meter slope. And this area was occupied by landfills. This was left over from the construction process of the dike. And people would use it spontaneously. And as unfortunately, as it happens a lot in Brazilian cities, what should be the waterfront is the water back and is used to dump garbage and so many things that are not appealing to not to the environment and not to the people. So there was a big effort in the process to reconnect the landscape, the surrounding urban tissue through the park. So this is very quickly the whole plan of the project. Each area has an anchor, so it tries to ensure that people will find different activities throughout the park. And it also has a division on the cross section, which is very important. Up here, you have the road that I was mentioning. On the slope, we accommodated all the park's infrastructure, either for services like toilets and maintenance for the park itself, as commercial services, small places that would keep the park vibrant for the maximum number of hours. The natural slope of the terrain was used to accommodate this infrastructure. And then there is an area that runs between the lake itself the riparian area, in an area that's subject to flooding. So there, we didn't add much infrastructure, it's grass and some pathways. The first section is Orla Mostra is Clear, that was done first. And all of these things try to connect with the surrounding areas and what's available in the city already, establish new connections with the natural environment, allow for the fruition of the natural landscape, not only contemplate the water, but get close to it. So create these promenades that touch upon the water itself, and create multiple experiences for those that are enjoying the space. And by doing so, trying to create also new perspectives of seeing things that are already part of the landscape. This is an iconic monument that the city has on the border of Guaíba, the Gasômetro Usina. And as I have already mentioned, taking advantage of the site's topography. So these linear structures that accommodate the infrastructure of the park, and also accommodate the existing vegetation. This is important because mature trees are precious. They took a long time to get into the shape that they are now. So we didn't take them down. We tried to keep as many as possible, those that were healthy, particularly the native species, to have this impression that the park was already made. So here you have an overall view of this first section. And the idea of using the steps that lead to the park as benches to enjoy the sunset that's very famous in this area. And also creating new landmarks. This is a 24-hour restaurant that works as a lantern in the nightscape and is always there for people to visit. Jaime had the chance to visit during its construction. These different environments create different, require different types of vegetation. So there was a careful study in this regard as well. The effort to enjoy the night hours. There will be a video that I'm going to leave, and I would ask you to please watch it. It gives the real impression of how the place transforms in the nighttime. More recently, there was a second section that was inaugurated as a sports park. So radical sports, traditional sports, you name it. It is managed by the city, and it has been crowded since its inauguration. And you can practice soccer, tennis, volleyball, and ride your skates. And to finish, Jaime used to say that a park one only begins, because the continuity and the life of the project was going to be given by the people who are going to be enjoying it. It's an urban acupuncture. Jaime wrote a book about it that I invite you to look into it as well. This is the video, and should you have any questions, do feel free to contact us about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will going to post the link in the chat, and let's move to Germany.
Great. Thanks again. Thanks again to you, Ariadne and Michael, for those inspiring presentations. I will complete this little series of presentations. I will take you to Germany and present the project of the Hafen City in Hamburg. In fact, the Hafen City in Hamburg is one of Europe's biggest inner city urban development projects. And the inner city here is not just a topic of extending the city itself by about 40%. It's also about the notions of density and the mix of uses that served as a guideline when designing this urban development project. In order to understand this project, we take a look at the historic development On the left-hand side, you see how in an ideal world, Hamburg would have been developed back in the days. And on the right-hand side, you see how Hamburg actually developed, because it was blocked towards the south by the River Elbe and its harbor facilities. Also, this historic map, you can see how the big part of the inner part of Hamburg was actually blocked by the barrier of the harbor activities towards the south. And if harbor activities back in the days meant a lot of manual labor, unloading cargo from the ships to carts, trains, and even warehouses close to the docks, this changed drastically in the middle of the 20th century with the invention of the standard shipping container. It revolutionized logistics and transport with automatization, scale and volume grew. Ships became bigger and bigger. And within a couple of years, those old harbor facilities and dock lanes became obsolete. The same happened here in Hamburg. And at the same time, this meant a big chance for Hamburg to actually create a stronger connection to the river. So how do we get from this kind of waiting land to an urban master plan? So back in the 1990s, Hamburg saw this opportunity and they launched an international competition. And in 1999, it was announced ASTOC with KCAP and Hamburg Plan as the winners of this competition. So with a few slides, I would like to introduce you to some of the basic concepts behind this design. So firstly, we see the historic center marked here with this big black blotch with the old defense area, now parks and railway corridors, and how the future Hafen City was meant to extend the inner city by those 40%. Some of the key concepts are actually connecting the city via sightlines to the water and structuring the planning area with public spaces and opening deep into the urban fabric, and thus maximizing the waterfront locations and views and good plots for future development. The second very important thing is identifying special locations throughout the territory of the planning area. In this case, it's the concept of the outer and inner triangle. And the outer triangle actually consists out of the Spiegel headquarter, which is some kind of Times magazine in Germany, and the world famous Elbphilharmonie here in the west, and the future 250-meter Elb Tower towards the east. And then there's the inner triangle, where there's already the Hafen City University occupying one of these spots. The third important part is, how do you bring scale to such a project? So the whole area was subdivided in about 10 different neighborhoods with different characteristics. And I would like to show you just a brief overview what kind of characteristics these neighborhoods could have. So firstly, in the north, we have the Sandtorkai, where we have some kind of point blocks with generous distances between them to provide visual connections and the views to the historic warehouse district just north of it. Secondly, on the second K, the Dalman K, we have open blocks to maximize the views to the river. And the third K, we're at Strandkai, we have perimeter blocks combined with small high-rise buildings to create some kind of silhouette of the Hamburg city towards the south. And moving further to the east towards the center of the planning territory, we are in the central location where we have dense perimeter blocks that form this central part of the development. And here in this abstract plan, you find a lot of these things combined into one plan, starting with the historic warehouse district to the north, the point blocks just south of it, or for example, at the Strandkai, the combination of perimeter blocks with a series of small high-rise buildings. And you might notice the small yellow areas around it. So that's the outer and the inner triangle of special locations, which should be occupied by special uses and special architecture. So if we translate this into abstract framework into actual built structures, you get to this kind of planning layout. And this plan also not only shows the building structures, but also the importance of the landscaping and the open space in this concept. So we have a very diverse green structures in the urban fabric, and they come in different sizes, proportions, functions, and also designs to create individual atmospheres and cater for all sorts of users and users through the time. Some basic data, don't worry, I won't point out all of it, just want to point out 2 or 3 important aspects out of these. For example, in total, we have 38% of public parks, squares, promenades, or private open space that is publicly accessible. And in a project of this size and in this location, 38% of public open space is a relatively high number. Secondly, we have a relatively balanced mix of uses, whereas 35% of the gross floor area are designated to residential use, and about 1/4, 25 to 30% of this will be subsidized housing. Another important number is that there have been 3 billion euros of public investment in this project, which generated another 10 billion of private investment. And of course, a lot of this public investment you actually cannot see. A lot of it went into embankment, flood protection, road infrastructure, technical infrastructure, but also, of course, public open spaces. And in these images, you can actually see the high quality of the design and the material that was used in this context. So it's about attractive open spaces to relax, to meet, to enjoy the sunset, where we have some similarities to the previous presentation. Also the connection to water. Also in this case, we have a high difference between the actual normal water level and the flood protected area. It's about 8 to 9 meters. And with these terraced landscape layouts, you bring the people closer to the water. And then it's also about creating an atmosphere, small, vibrant squares with a wide variety and mix of functions. For example, here, a cafe, restaurants, you see cyclists, pedestrians, people play sports. And in the building next to it, there's residential, offices, all sorts of things, just bring them together in one single spot. And then, of course, we have a lot of new parks and more than 10 kilometers of new dockside promenades throughout the project. And now I would like to take you through a few neighborhoods just to give you a little bit of a better understanding what the actual built environment looks like. We start with the Dalmankai here right in the center. We have an asymmetric profile, mix of uses, different typologies, and an open block structure opening towards the south and providing views to the second and third row, views to the water. And at the far end, we see the location of the Elbphilharmonie. This is the image of the same site. We're looking in the southern harbor basin towards the promenade at the half height between the water level and the flood protected ground level of the buildings. And you see a very diverse kind of architecture. And the final spot of this quay is the famous Elbphilharmonie by Herzog and de Mauron. The second quarter I would like to show you is the Überseequartier or overseas quarter, which is characterized by a more dense perimeter block. They have been shaped and adopted to create some kind of inner canyon. It's a pedestrianized shopping street that runs diagonally from north to south through this dense mixed-use neighborhoods to end up here at the cruise ship terminal at the harbor basin. This is an image of the northern part of this part of the project, where you can see that the subtle colors of the bricks and metal cladding of this new architecture matches very well with the existing bricks and color scheme of the historic buildings. And if we move further south towards the edge of the project and towards the River Elbe, this would be the future location of the cruise ship terminal. Here, this corridor would end in these more lighter, almost white buildings forming the silhouette of the southern edge of the Hafen city. And these two small towers actually mark the entrance to the corridor and are designed by UN Studio. And to finalize the presentation, if we move further east, so the project is continuing fastly towards the finalization. We're extending east. We have a lot higher amount of, or higher share of residential uses in this part of the project. Also in this case, the strategy is applied to bring in public space first. First create a location, create a high quality public spaces, and then the actual architecture surrounding it. And this case is a very good example. We're here on this small island here in the harbor basin. And once this was created, people started flocking here, even on weekends, playing sports, spending time with their families. Even as you can see here, there hasn't been even a single building surrounding it. But these buildings will come, and they will, at the end of this harbor basin, the Barkenhafen, they will create another strong anchor with office uses, residential, and so forth, and also another attractive public space right at the end of the harbor basin. And finally, construction started with the Elb Tower, the future 250-meter high-rise right here at this far end of the Hafen City, which complete this concept of the outer and the inner triangle. So this will be in the future the third currently unoccupied spot of that triangle. And with this image, I would like to finish the presentation. And once the Elb Tower will be finished, from competition to completion, we will have look at a time span of more than 25 to 30 years. So we as urban planners also have to bring in a lot of patience to see these projects evolve and get them to the end. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Manuel. It was very interesting, and thank you to all of you. I really enjoyed all the presentations. So I see that we don't have any questions yet, so I want to encourage everyone to write down their questions in the Q&A. And I'm going to start with my own question. So first, maybe Manuel, the question's for you. I noticed in your presentation that the residential, the number of residents, it's something around 16,000 people. I was wondering, because comparing to Toronto, that's a very low number. I was wondering if this is something that you have considered, or is there any place for increasing that projection in the future? Yeah, so that's the first question I have for you.
Right. Thanks a lot for that question. It's actually hitting a very interesting spot in this master plan, because there was always the notion of creating a dynamic master plan that just sets the basic frameworks, and within individual steps of development, certain things can be adopted. And in this case, in the year 2008 until 10, there was another revision of the initial master plan from the 2000s. So actually the whole eastern part that I showed you in the end, initially was just conceived as more like a suburban, almost suburban, less dense environment. And with this revision in 2008 and 10, actually the whole concept of how the public transport will work and how the density will work and the mix of uses was adapted. And from the initial total square meters of, I think it was some 1.5 million square meters, it was increased to 2.4 million. Because for example, in the beginning, there was always only a tram line linking the Hafen city to other parts of the city. And then things changed and they built a proper subway connection. And by these kind of steps, it was also possible to increase the density. So in that sense, it has been increased from the initial plan already. And as construction is moving forward relatively quickly, and we're moving towards the eastern end of the project, I personally don't think that there's much more density or adjustment that can be done, but it already has been done in the past.
Cool, thank you. It's actually a very interesting challenge because, as you mentioned, developing new neighborhoods is a very lengthy process, and we are living in a world that everything is changing very fast. So actually, my next question is for all of you. I want to know, how do you make sure that your designs are kind of future-proof and you have room for the changes that you cannot really anticipate right now. So maybe Ariadne, you can start, and then you can take turn answering this question.
We try to provide the basic infrastructure so you can accommodate the present uses and leave enough room open for future demands that we can't foresee. You may notice that in the park there are a lot of open areas that are left, how could I say, unprogrammed. So they can accommodate future uses as people and the changes of the city require. I saw that there was a question about the resilience to climate change. The way that the project was designed in that cross-section that I tried to illustrate, you have areas that allow for the water level to rise without damaging the permanent infrastructure. So it was a thought that takes into consideration the water movement in perhaps the rising levels in the future.
Great, thank you. So maybe Michael, you can try answering that question before I go to the other questions.
Sure. I mean, I think a master plan, we have to remember, is always a framework and should provide flexibility for the future. Market conditions may change. It's important to have a phasing strategy that looks at a variety of factors, including kind of current economic needs, current transit needs, current existing infrastructure, tying into that. So we usually look at phasing that there's a piece of it which is more immediate as a catalyst project, and then the rest of it could change over time. We may be able to kind of swap GFA or change land uses. We like to look a lot at mixed use so that we can have kind of a balance between commercial and residential and shift those as necessary, again, as the market changes. So when you're looking at a 20 or 25 year plus build out, as Manuel mentioned, you have to have some flexibility in that plan, but it's important to get kind of the open space structure right, the block framework right, the scale of public spaces so that they're human scaled, and then to think about, you know, resiliency as well and how climate change is going to impact it. So in Saigon, we were very careful about understanding, you know, what are predicted increases in levels of the Saigon River. How could we allow for some of that stormwater to be received on site? How could we elevate certain sections through a kind of gradually ascending riparian zone to accommodate those heights? So similar to what Ariadne said, you don't want to impact any permanent infrastructure, but you might have to give up some of that public open space as those water levels rise. So all of those considerations go into a really flexible planning framework.
Great, thank you. So while we are still with you, the next question is referring to your project in Vietnam, and someone wants to know when the plan would be implemented. Is there a timeline for that?
Yeah, we've received preliminary planning approvals from the People's Committee, which is essentially the mayor and city council of Ho Chi Minh City. We're trying to do a similar thing with the entirety of District 4. So it's not just looking at the waterfront, but trying to get planning approvals for the entire district. And we've been looking at, again, not just the public open space in that district, but kind of surgical development as well that takes some of the pressure off of the historic core of Ho Chi Minh City, that existing downtown. You don't want to have a lot of density in that, you know, adjacent to the historic opera, that's kind of French colonial settlement, things like that. So we're trying to shift some of that into District 4 and also create opportunities for them. So it's a process that's tied together. We also have a few landowner holdouts along the waterfront that we're trying to kind of mitigate and figure out how the plan can adapt to that over time and incorporate them into the overall plan. So it requires kind of a shift and some balance, but I hope we'll begin to see it implemented within the next 5 years or so.
Great. So Manuel, next question is for you. So someone wonders, if the lands of Hafen City are all owned by the city, or there are various landowners?
Basically, when the project started, it was created an entity which is called the Hafen City Gesellschaft. It's an institution owned by the city, but acting as more like in a company structure, providing the whole project development and getting investors involved and organizing public participation, all these things. I mean, a project of this size, you need a proper organizational structure to address all the different needs and communication and cater for all the different interests that are involved in this. So, I mean, yes, in this case, the whole territory, as far as I know, was owned by the city and then transferred to this entity of the Hafen City Gesellschaft.
Okay. So next question is regarding the parking strategy in all the developments. Ellie wants to know how you approach this parking issue. He says that they are currently working on a waterfront development, and they're trying to limit basements to dry conditions, primarily not to affect the coral reefs and to lower costs. But apparently it's almost impossible to satisfy the demand. He would love to hear your thoughts and strategies for this.
All right, maybe I just continue. In the example of the Hafen City, public transport was one of the key aspects. First of all, I explained earlier, there was just a tram plan. Now we have the extension of the U4, which is a high capacity subway line. And this makes it possible to further reduce private car ownership. And then, of course, there are the mobility strategies that we as urban planner are familiar with. For example, electric vehicles, buses, of course, but also a lot of car sharing, especially, as I just mentioned, the eastern extension, where we have a higher amount of residential users. They have a very ambitious strategy of car sharing to actually reduce the necessary car spaces in underground parking. But that's actually a big challenge, especially when we talk about flood protection of those areas and convincing people that these areas might get flooded in extreme situations. So it's kind of challenging.
Yeah, you're right. So this question would be the last question, and it's for you, Michael, because we are trying to wrap it up before 11 a.m. So this is the last one. So someone is asking, Michael, new development will increase land value in the larger area. Can you discuss how this may or may not impact the existing neighbors? If so, what can be done to mitigate this?
That's a fantastic question, and gentrification obviously is a concern and an issue all the time. And one thing, when we looked at that sliver of waterfront, in addition to kind of looking at District 4, we thought about how that is going to increase land values. And what we did was try to talk to the city about the larger value of District 4 on the economy of the city. It was already a kind of a hub for street food. A lot of tourists were kind of exploring that area. There's kind of wonderful off the beaten track culture that's happening there. And so really intentional conversations with the government about protecting the character of that district in terms of the overall identity of the larger city. Obviously, there will be things that are upgraded. We didn't want to have any existing neighborhoods, blocks kind of displaced. So we have a zero displacement strategy in the open space strategy for all of District 4. But things may be upgraded. We might see some of the existing residential units, which are typically these 3-4 story kind of housing blocks. Some of them may become bed and breakfast. We might see more ground floor retail or restaurants open up. So we're hoping that the waterfront development actually provides opportunity to the people who live in the community to have new opportunities for them as well. So it's always a balance, but we think that maintaining that density within the larger district will help to kind of allow them to stay in place.
Great, thank you. So we need to close it up. I want to thank you all the panelists for accepting our invitation and joining us. It was, for me, it was really informative. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us. And to those who we did not get to answer the question, I'm really sorry. Maybe you can ask the questions in the LinkedIn and we can continue the discussion in the comments. Yeah, so that's it for the first episode of our new Urban Design Roundtables. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Negar, if I have just 1 second, there was a question that I think I would like to address very, very quickly about the lessons learned.
If it's very quickly, sure.
During the elaboration of the project, we had to present it several times in the city of Porto Alegre. In one of these occasions, Jaime was booed by his own colleagues at the Architects Institute in Porto Alegre. And sometimes it takes a lot of guts from the municipality to actually make these projects happen. You have to face some opposition and not to be intimidated by it. I think that is an important lesson. Have courage.
Thank you. And we're going to end with that important point. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.